SVC Media.
Welcome to the iGaming Daily Podcast, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market.
The U.S. federal excise tax has existed long before the repeal of Paspa, but it is a subject that rarely gets discussed. Until now. Last week, federal lawmakers introduced the Gambling Addiction Recovery Investment and Treatment Act, or the GRIT Act, which would take money collected through the federal excise tax and apply it to RG causes. The measure was not well received by operators, though, as the American Gaming Association has come out against it. Why would the industry oppose such a measure? We'll discuss just that on today's episode of iGaming Daily. iGaming Daily is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. 56% of the EGR Power 50 personalized player experiences with Optimove. Now, I am not going to ICE, but it almost makes me want to pick up a ticket. If you are going to ICE, all you have to do is go by the Optimove stand, mention iGaming Daily, and you're going to get a free Amazon gift card. Now that I've given you that tip, go get it, and then send $1 my way with a nice little gift. I am joined, Jessica Welman. I'm not joined by myself. I'm Jessica Welman, editor of SBC Americas. I'm joined by my colleague, Charlie Horner. Charlie, are you going to ICE?
I am indeed. I'll be going for a couple of days. So, yeah, it would be rude of anyone attending not to go and pick up on that offer.
I know. It's free stuff. Who doesn't love free stuff? So, now we'll dive into something that is actually quite expensive. That's the best I can do at a segue on such short notice. We don't get federal gaming legislation very often, Charlie, and we got some last week. What did you think when you read the GRIT Act?
Great name for a start. It's not quite the one that we were discussing last week, the, let's help our veterans and children.
If you
bill.
don't hate veterans, we can have VLTs, Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, joking aside, I do think that a strong name can help a bill like this gain traction. And, we're talking about it. I'm sure other people will be talking about it. On the surface of things, you would think that taking half of the money from the federal excise tax and putting it into problem gambling support and research, education and treatment would be a positive thing, something that most of the industry would be able to get behind. In my opinion, it seems a pretty straightforward thing to do. However, as we're going to discuss, that's not as everyone is taking. It's not how everyone is taking it.
It's a little more complicated than that. So let me just explain really quickly that the federal excise tax is 0.25% of tax on handle, not on revenue. So on as many bets as there are placed. Eyeballing the numbers from last year, that equates to roughly $250 million. Interesting thing, lawmakers have asked, where does this money go? Where is it being spent? And no one has ever really been able to tell us. So the idea of the GRIT Act solves a problem, which is this money is coming in and it doesn't seem like anybody's doing anything with it. So what should we do with this sum of money? The reaction that is negative to this is that preferably, the industry would like to not have the federal excise tax whatsoever. It does predate Paspa. It was kind of brought about around the time that the Wire Act came into play, which is the 60s. So it was essentially never designed to be this like cash cow bringing in money from state sports books. So that's kind of why the AGA is somewhat opposed to it. Charlie, I'm sure you've written it. I feel like I've written this story 1,000 times. Every year, Dina Titus, a representative out of Nevada, introduces a bill to repeal this excise tax.
Sure, yeah. This is something that we come to expect every year, and it's difficult when you've got a big pile of cash there that is seemingly not doing much. I can understand why the industry would want to scrap it, but then on the other hand, it does make sense from a federal government point of view to actually put that money to some good use. It shocks me really that it hasn't been put to good use up until this point, really. So it's an interesting debate, and I'm sure that the AGA will continue to campaign to repeal it altogether.
Yeah, they've been doing this, Titus, I think the first year she really started asking about the tax and taking action towards it was 2014. So nearly a decade. Now, I am going to butcher this Pennsylvania lawmaker's name. It's Guy Renchislar. I'm sorry, sir. I hope you're not listening. Is on the other side of the aisle, and that's something that the excise tax repeal bill does have going for it. It is bipartisan, whereas the GRIT Act is two Democrats behind it, Richard Blumenthal and Andrea Salinas. So, anybody even notionally following the U.S. government knows that bipartisan support is way better than not bipartisan support when it comes to the federal government, but it also hasn't really led to anything yet. So I guess the question kind of is, how long do you keep fighting this fight to get this tax repealed that is going nowhere versus taking the PR win of saying we're going to take $250 million and put it towards responsible gambling solutions? That's kind of the big question at the heart of all of this.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you can see why they would keep going instead of giving up and essentially that being the status quo for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years or whatever. I think it's probably a case of getting the messaging right on the AGA and the industry's behalf. From what I can gather at the moment, their messaging is this is going to help illegal offshore sports books. But that we hear this line quite a lot, really, when it comes to gambling and regulation and laws. It's always we need this to help curb the illegal offshores, and it's a valid point. But if you keep saying the exact same line year in year out, are you necessarily going to get a different outcome? So it's an interesting one, and it would be very interesting to see if they evolve that messaging in the next year or so.
Yeah, and in the back half of the show today, I'm going to speak with Alex Kane, co-founder and CEO of Sporttrade, which is a betting exchange. It's one of the smaller operators out there. And he's going to give some context to how, especially for smaller operators, how onerous this tax really is. I know in your head, people are hearing 0.25%. How bad can that be? Even if you're holding 10%, that then becomes 2.5% of your revenue that you're giving away to the federal government, who can't even tell you what they're doing with it. That there's absolutely motivation and rationale behind repealing the federal excise tax. I think the question just is, if we've gone this long and really not gotten anywhere with it, what is the chance that this moves forward? Although, I guess the other side of the coin is, what is the chance that the GRIT Act moves forward? It just got introduced last week. As I mentioned, it's not a bipartisan bill, but there's a lot of kind of consternation at the federal level. Blumenthal was a lawmaker who was writing numerous open letters to sports books, working with colleges and things like that, that they do feel like they need to do something about sports betting. I feel that kind of in the air and in the conversations. We had the Tonko proposition that is just the whole full blackballing of sports betting ads. This one certainly feels a much, much more tenable. And as a lawmaker, you get to say, I put an exorbitant amount of money, resources that were never given to this industry before, towards problem gambling issues. And two, I get to do it without changing a dime of taxes.
Yeah, the industry has taken such a PR hit in the last 12 to 18 months. We've spoken a lot about it on the podcast last year. We did a documentary at SBC Summit North America last year about the PR and optics hit that the industry's had ever since really that, those series of New York Times articles that went out late 2022 and really drew public attention to some of the practices of the industry, whether for right or wrong, whether for true or false. That's what they've reported. And the image of sports betting took a bit of a hit. I remember you wrote a really good op-ed last year, Jess, about the optics problem that sports books have this year at the moment. This feels like an easy win, right? It's not gonna take any extra taxes. It's a good PR win. Let's give some money to support problem gambling that might not be funded to the best of its abilities at the moment, and give some support to the people that the industry has negatively impacted.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the numbers of what states that even have earmarked budgets for RG and PG issues are, and we're talking $2 million on the high end of thing, maybe $10 million. It's an underfunded industry. The AGA statement that they provided to us on SBC Americas noted that more and more money is being put towards RG. And while I don't disagree with that, I do disagree with the idea that it's enough. I think everyone would agree more money is never going to be a bad thing. But again, it's this federal excise tax is much more impactful than I think people realize. And with that, we're going to take a break, but please keep tuned in because Alex Kane from Sporttrade is going to explain why. Charlie, thank you for joining me. Be sure to come back next week and we'll find something hopefully a little more chipper to talk about.
Brazil, a global economic powerhouse, deeply passionate about sports, and now home to one of the hottest markets in gaming. And we're giving it the full SBC treatment. Join industry leaders, market experts, and all the major players in the country for 3 days of content, exhibition, and epic networking at the first ever SBC Summit Rio.
Welcome back to iGaming Daily, brought to you by Optimove. As I mentioned in the first segment, the federal excise tax is something that certainly impacts operators. So we're going to chat with an operator who always has interesting opinions about tax rates of all kinds. Alex Kane, the founder and CEO of Sporttrade. Alex, we've been on panels together. I've seen you talk on Twitter about it, and you're kind of you're my tax operator guy because you do explain it so succinctly. So thank you for coming on and chatting with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so to just dive right in, as an operator, how much does 0.25% of handle really translate to revenue? Because on the state level, that's what we're seeing get taxed, Tennessee accepted. So, and is that universal across the board? Is the 0.25% on handle, just a number that's the same for FanDuel, for you, for whoever?
Yeah, so the really simple way to think about it is obviously the federal excise tax is a 0.25% tax on handle, which is the amount that customers wager. And the sort of unfair thing about the federal excise tax is that it's not equally applied. If you take a model like FanDuel, and let's say FanDuel holds 10%, which means for every $100 of handle, there's going to be $10 of hold by FanDuel at the end of the month. And that's fairly consistent with, state to state reports that we see. Sporttrade, on the other hand, we can have a handle as low as 1%. And so do you think about the federal excise tax? The federal excise tax is 0.25% of handle. Well, if we're holding 1% of handle, then 0.25% of 1 is a whopping 25% of our revenue is the federal excise tax. Whereas with FanDuel, 0.25% of handle, if you're holding 10%, is actually 10x less. It's actually only 2.5% of your revenue. In other words, we're paying 10x more of our revenue on a percentage of revenue basis to the federal government for the federal excise tax than a higher hold operator. And what that ends up being is like you're almost penalized for offering a fairer, tighter, more sort of fairer market to customers because you're paying more of what you keep to the federal government. So it's definitely not fairly applied operator to operator.
Have you kind of run the numbers, like if that excise tax were to go away, how much, capital that would free up for you and the kinds of things you could do as an operator? If it was, it's probably a little disappointing to run those numbers, but I assume you kind of know how much it's costing you each year.
Yeah, the answer is it's about 20% of our revenue back. So our largest two expenses as a very low hold operator. And by the way, we love being a low hold operator because
that's the goal for you guys.
It's the goal. Low hold means more lower, taking less from customers on each bet. Like we want the amount, like if you go and place a bet on Sporttrade right now and it's $100 bet, like in theory, you're just sort of paying us $1. Over time, it sort of comes out to be that's what you're going to lose. I'd love that number to be lower. But the two biggest expenses that we have are the federal excise tax and the costs of deposits and withdrawals, because those really are more of a function of player handle than they are of player revenue. We pay a couple of other costs that are a function of revenue, but those are a function of handle. And for us, it would probably be, as I mentioned, probably like 20%, 25% back in our pocket. And again, it doesn't go back in our pocket. The beautiful thing about the way our business works is that it kind of would just matriculate back to the customer and the odds would get even better. And so to me, like all of the revenue in this industry comes from the customer. And so the way Sporttrade and the way we think about it is like they are the only stakeholder we focus on the most. And I know we're going to talk about RG, and that's something really important to us as well. And that's a huge aspect of this. But I think it's not something like, oh, Sporttrade gets to keep all this money. It's like, it's sort of by the competitive nature of our product ends up back in the customer's pocket. And like, shouldn't that be the stakeholder that matters the most in this?
Well, and for you too, your whole kind of value prop is offering this different market experience, that it's an exchange, that it's low margins, that it's for people who are really trying to find sharp lines, that fees like this, you have to question. I would assume other operators might feel compelled to push more high hold kind of bets. And if you did that, then you kind of lose what makes you special in the market, right?
Yep, 100%. It really is our ethos too. I mean, it just sounds wacky and like, I don't believe this guy. And that would be very fair because, I recognize the industry that we're in. But when I tell you it's our mission and it's our vision, like we want, when players transact and decide to place a regulated sports bet, we want the cost of that bet, the cost of that entertainment for those that aren't sharp, for those that don't have an edge, to be as low as possible. And like if FanDuel's offering 20 to 1, we'd love to offer you 30 to 1. Why not? I mean, the true price is still 32 to 1 over time. Unfortunately, the revenue has to come from somewhere, and it does come from the players. And I think we're realistic about that. But I think the rate at which we'd like to do that is a lot more sustainable, I think, than the 10% hold product.
I'm curious, you have such a grasp. If you look at Alex's Twitter, it's a great follow, of how these revenue reports are kind of looking at taxes. So as Sporttrade looks into new states, as a smaller operator, how much does the tax model of a state weigh on your decision of if it's worth trying to get in there or not?
Very heavily. I'd say between taxes and licensing fees, it's a significant. I mean, there's some states that will never be able to enter. I think is with the turn of 2024 and this, what's going on in Georgia is really the sort of moment that we're going to actually start to formalize a bit of a model of regulation, legislation, licensing, and tax. And what we believe is that licensing and tax rates should be on a graduated rate. That the
which
more
is what
that you
Georgia is proposing.
Very close, yeah. The more that you hold, right, just like that FanDuel example, the more room you actually have to pay a state revenue tax, rather. So if you're a FanDuel and you're holding 10%, federal excise tax is only 2.5% of your revenue, you have 97.5 to play with. If you're sport trading, you're holding 1%, well, that's 25% out the door. You actually only have 75 to play with. So you should pay a higher percentage of the 97.5 to the state than you should of the 75 to the state if you're a lower hold operator. And I think this very simple way to do that isn't by player prop or by bet type. It's by your hold. If you decide to offer player props that parlays at a lower hold, the same sort of concept should apply. If you decide to offer a straight bet at a very high hold, you shouldn't get the benefit of a lower tax. It should simply be based on how much was bet this month, how much did you play out to players, that's your hold. Take that number, divide it by the total bet amount, that's your hold percentage. The higher the hold percentage, the more room you have to pay state gross gaming revenue tax.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned RG earlier. The piece of this whole federal excise tax debate that is now in play is that there is a suggestion to take, last year it was roughly $250 million that was taken in federal excise tax that we, to our knowledge, have no idea where it goes. And so at least this would tag it for something that is vitally important to the industry. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of suggest how you think the taxation model at the federal or the state level can address RG that isn't as punitive as it can be with what we've been discussing about the federal excise tax.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is I know Brianna pretty well, and she's actually, I would say, a closer and closer friend of mine. We ran into each other at the Nickel G's conference, which was great. I hope she gave you, or I hope you gave her a winning tip on the horse bet.
Her horse scratched, so that's the best. She got her money back, which is better than most people, right?
She actually did better than most. That's correct. I can't say the same. Arpita, Anthony, and I placed a couple of dollar wagers, and they all lost. If you were to tell me right now the federal excise tax, Alex, will never go away for the next 100 years, then I would say 100% of the excise tax should go to responsible gaming. 100%. I think the problem we have with this construct of federal excise tax is that, from that simple example, Sporttrade is paying 10x more of its revenue to responsible gaming than FanDuel. When in reality, when I think about, you turn on the TV and you see the same game parlay and the boost, and the brilliant marketing that they do to get players to bet more and constant bonuses, shouldn't it be the other way around? Shouldn't FanDuel, both by the margin they are able to pay, the margin they keep, but also their advertising practices, shouldn't they pay 10x more of their revenue to responsible gaming than Sporttrade? We don't ping players that churn and give them a bonus. We're not on TV pushing the same game parlays. Here's the CEO saying we want the cost of your transaction to be as low as possible. So I think the way to solve it, my solution would be a graduated rate of your hold. The higher that you hold as a percentage, the more of that percentage on a gross gaming revenue basis you should pay to responsible gaming. I think it should start as low as maybe 1% of your revenue, and for FanDuel go up to as high as 10%, or these higher hold products of your revenue. And now you've tilted things back and you've leveled the playing field to say the operators that are holding more and are pushing more of these high hold products and have more money to pay for advertising and have a higher margin, they should pay more into the pot for responsible gaming than the operators that are trying to push down and cram down that cost of the sports bet to as low as possible.
Well, I mean, and even, ethos aside, just proportional revenue, each of you, there's no objection to paying into RG programs, but it should be even across the board of what you're generating as a company percentage-wise going back to that effort.
Yep. So at the current rate, if proposed, it would be half of the federal excise tax, so 0.125%. So for us, we'd be paying 12.5% of our revenue to RG. I think even any RG sort of proponent is saying to themselves, oh, wait a minute, hang on a second. I always thought books were holding closer to maybe 5-10%. So I actually thought that we were going to be taking around 2.5 to 5% of the revenue, cutting that in half, 1.25 to 2.5. Oh, wait a second, here's this lower hold operator, 12.5%. Like even, no, that's not. So I think that like the intent is really good, and is this structure right now, and the people don't know where that money's going. The problem we have is with that underlying structure of taxing of an operator based on hold, because it sort of doesn't normalize for revenue. It doesn't normalize for how low our hold is. And so I'd love to be very much a part of like potential solutions. And I think the potential solution at a state, potentially even a federal level, is to have it based on your gross gaming revenue percent, and it be graduated on the bigger that hold percentage is.
Yeah, it's a topic that doesn't get enough discussion. There's a lot to discuss about it. So thank you for taking time today to chat with us. And be sure to, Alex, where can they find you on Twitter? Because you are a good follow. So what is your handle?
I appreciate those two plugs. That's very appreciated. You're quite the follow as well. So folks have to make sure to follow you. My Twitter is at @A_Kane47. That's where you can find me on Twitter. And so I'm pretty vocal on there, and I appreciate you following and supporting.
Yeah, it's a good point of view, and glad to get it on iGaming Daily. Thank you guys for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you for listening to today's iGaming Daily podcast, supported by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming market. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.